It was a bitterly cold night in Prague, the kind of night when fog seeps into every crevice of the city and the gas lamps flicker as if struggling to hold back the darkness. Inside a narrow, timbered house on a quiet street, a single candle trembled on a table, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. In a small, dimly lit room, a child lay huddled beneath a thin quilt, whispering softly to the empty corners as though addressing unseen companions. The words were barely audible, fragmented syllables that seemed to carry both innocence and a strange, uncanny knowledge far beyond the child's age. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes and made the shutters groan. It was a night that would later be remembered not for its weather, but for the first time a nurse vanished from a household without explanation, leaving behind a child who would haunt the family and perhaps the city itself. The nurse's departure was not announced. No one saw her leave, yet by morning, her absence was undeniable. She had been a quiet presence in the household for months, her actions meticulous, her demeanor professional yet distant. Servants barely noticed her as she moved through the corridors, and yet, there had always been something almost imperceptibly unsettling about the way she attended to the child. Her eyes, dark and watchful, seemed to linger on the child longer than necessary, as if she saw things no one else could. She spoke softly, her voice measured, and the child, once shy and withdrawn, now seemed to respond to her in an almost conspiratorial manner, sharing secrets in hushed tones that no one else could understand. Then, one night, she simply vanished, leaving behind only her small satchel and the lingering odor of lavender that clung faintly to the linens. When the first household members discovered the child alone, a sense of unease immediately filled the room. The parents, prominent figures in the city, initially assumed the nurse had simply been called away on urgent business, though no explanation was ever provided. Yet, the child's behavior did not align with ordinary abandonment. Instead of crying or seeking comfort, the child seemed almost expectant, eyes wide and alert, as if awaiting some invisible presence. The whispers continued, directed at no one and everyone at once, and there was a rhythm to them, an almost melodic quality that was at once disturbing and mesmerizing. It was a sound that the family could not ignore, a sound that carried an insinuation of hidden knowledge, of warnings, or perhaps confessions the child could not articulate in any other way. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes too. Late at night, faint noises drifted from the house, whispers or soft laughter, though no one dared approach closely. The shadows on the walls seemed to move independently, stretching and contorting as though alive. Servants who had worked in the home for years spoke in hushed tones of seeing the child standing at the window, staring out into the fog, murmuring words that made no sense to them but seemed purposeful to the child. Some claimed to feel an icy draft when passing the child's room, a chill that had no source in the winter air. There was a growing sense among those who witnessed these phenomena that the household had entered a liminal space, a threshold between ordinary life and something inexplicably otherworldly. The city itself provided an eerie backdrop for these events. Prague, with its winding cobbled streets, Gothic spires, and labyrinthine alleys, was a place steeped in legend. The locals spoke of spirits and restless souls, of shadows that moved in the corners of one's vision, and of children who carried the marks of otherworldly encounters. Tales of vanished persons and mysterious whispers were not uncommon in whispered tavern conversations, but there was an undeniable tension when the story of this particular child began to circulate. Those who heard of the nurse's sudden disappearance and the child's strange behavior felt a mixture of fear and fascination, as though the city itself had become complicit in harboring secrets that refused to be understood. Within the household, the tension escalated. Parents tried to maintain normalcy, instructing servants to ignore the whispers, to soothe the child with toys, music, and attention. But nothing quelled the murmuring. Attempts to engage the child in conversation often resulted in cryptic responses, the child speaking in fragments that seemed to reference events or entities unknown to anyone else. Sleep became difficult for the entire household, as each night seemed to amplify the child's whispers and the shadows that clung to the corners of the rooms. A sense of dread began to grow, subtle at first, then more pronounced, as if the very walls of the house absorbed the presence of something unseen and patient, waiting to reveal itself at the perfect moment. Psychologists and doctors of the era, if consulted, might have labeled the behavior as hysteria, a symptom of a delicate constitution, or the product of a fertile imagination. Yet the child's knowledge and precision in describing details that could not have been known naturally defied easy explanation. It was not just the content of the whispers, but the timing, the tone, the very insistence of the voice that unsettled adults accustomed to reason and order. It was as though the child had become a conduit, a small vessel through which something, whether supernatural, psychological, or historical, was attempting to speak. And so, the mystery of the whispering child began, framed by the nurse's unexplained absence, the eerie ambience of the house, and the unforgiving backdrop of a city that seemed to harbor its own shadows. That single night became a pivot, a moment when the ordinary and the extraordinary collided. By the time the first tendrils of dawn crept over the Prague skyline, the household had already begun to fracture under the weight of questions no one could answer. The whispers had not ceased, they had only grown more insistent, more deliberate, echoing in empty hallways and embedding themselves in the minds of those who heard them. The nurse's departure, once a simple event, had become the spark for a story that would linger through generations, a story of innocence entwined with darkness, and a child whose voice refused to be silenced. The evening had passed, the candle had burned low, but the sense of watching, of being observed by something beyond comprehension, remained. And in that quiet, frozen room, the child whispered once more, words that promised neither comfort nor resolution, only the continuation of a mystery that would refuse to be explained. The nurse, gone without trace, had left behind more than a child, she had left a shadow, a whisper, a riddle poised to haunt Prague indefinitely. Prague in 1892 was a city of contrasts, a place where grandeur and decay coexisted in uneasy harmony. The skyline was punctuated by Gothic spires, their dark silhouettes cutting into the misty sky, while the narrow streets below twisted unpredictably, like veins running through the body of an ancient organism. Gas lamps lined the cobbled streets, their flickering light casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to creep along the walls of the centuries-old buildings. Fog often rolled in from the Vltava river, settling in the alleyways and squares, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. In this city, history was not a distant echo, it was a tangible presence, pressing down on the living with every worn stone and carved gargoyle. It was within this labyrinthine, shadow-laden environment that the household of the whispering child sat, unremarkable at first glance yet poised to become the epicenter of an enduring mystery. The neighborhood surrounding the house was a reflection of Prague itself, layered, complex, and tinged with both elegance and neglect. Merchants hawked their wares from wooden stalls, their voices carrying over the rattle of horse-drawn carriages. Children darted between the adults, playing games that balanced precariously on the edge of danger and delight. The smells of freshly baked bread mingled with the pungent odor of horse manure and smoke from the nearby foundries. It was a city alive with motion, yet for all its vibrancy, there lingered an underlying tension, a sense that the old and the new were constantly colliding. The industrial advances creeping into Prague, the social stratification, and the political murmurs of a city under Austro-Hungarian rule all contributed to a backdrop of subtle unease, an ambient anxiety that mirrored the more immediate disturbances within the walls of the household. The house itself, though modest by aristocratic standards, carried the weight of centuries. Its timber beams were darkened with age, and the walls bore the faint stains of past dampness and decay. Windows, tall and narrow, were crowned with intricate stone carvings that suggested a history of craftsmanship now faded. The front door, heavy and iron-bound, opened onto a small vestibule where dust lingered undisturbed for days at a time. Inside, the rooms were dimly lit, the furnishings a mixture of practicality and hints of once grand taste, a faded rug in the parlor, a silver candelabra on the dining table, a collection of books with yellowed pages stacked in precarious towers on the shelves. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the aging structure seemed amplified, echoing through the house in ways that made it feel alive, almost sentient. It was within this suffocating intimacy that the whispers of the child began to take on their full weight, their soft, fragmented syllables resonating against the wooden walls as if the house itself were listening. The family that inhabited this home was emblematic of Prague's social strata, well-educated, moderately wealthy, and conscious of their position within a city rife with both opportunity and danger. The father, a man of quiet demeanor and meticulous habits, oversaw business dealings that required frequent travel to the commercial centers of the city. The mother, equally attentive but more emotionally inclined, managed the household and sought to maintain a veneer of normalcy despite the subtle disturbances that had begun to unsettle their domestic routine. Their children were well-mannered, obedient, and seemingly ordinary in every respect, until the arrival of the nurse, and subsequently, the emergence of the whispers that would challenge their understanding of the world. The contrast between the family's outward respectability and the inexplicable phenomena within their home mirrored the broader tension of Prague itself, where appearances often masked deeper currents of fear, ambition, and superstition. Beyond the immediate household, Prague teemed with stories of the uncanny. Local folklore, woven into the fabric of daily life, spoke of restless spirits and shadowed apparitions, of children who saw things adults could not, and of houses whose walls seemed to remember past tragedies. Markets and taverns buzzed with rumors. A merchant would whisper of a vanished servant in a distant quarter, a cobbler might speak of strange sounds emanating from abandoned buildings. Even the educated elite, while outwardly dismissive of such tales, could not entirely escape the pervasive sense that the city itself was imbued with hidden life, with histories that refused to remain silent. This cultural backdrop made the household of the whispering child both a source of curiosity and unease. Any anomaly, however small, was amplified by the collective consciousness of a city already attuned to shadows and whispers. The streets outside the home were alive with the rhythms of daily existence, yet they also held a quiet menace for those attuned to the peculiarities of sound and movement. The wind that swept through the narrow alleys carried the faint echoes of footsteps long gone, the scent of smoke and earth, and occasionally, the faint hum of voices, whether real or imagined, seemed to follow the pedestrian from corner to corner. Even the river, the Vltava, with its steady flow, contributed to the city's haunting ambience, reflecting the dim gaslight and producing distorted images that danced across its surface. For the family within the house, this external world was both protective and threatening, a familiar environment that offered the routine of normal life, yet also a reminder of the larger, often inexplicable forces at play in a city that thrived on legend and memory alike. Within this setting, the events surrounding the child's whispers gained an almost inevitable quality. Prague, with its centuries of layered history, its fog-laden streets, and its omnipresent Gothic architecture, seemed predisposed to harbor mysteries that resisted explanation. The household, though modest, was a microcosm of this broader tension, order versus chaos, the seen versus the unseen, reason versus the inexplicable. Each day, as the fog rolled in and the city's gas lamps flickered to life, the whispers within the house became part of the ambient noise of Prague itself, blending with distant conversations, the clatter of carriages, and the echo of footsteps across cobbled streets. In this way, the city was not merely a backdrop but an active participant, shaping and amplifying the sense of unease that clung to the household like a second skin. The combination of architecture, climate, social structure, and folklore made Prague a character in its own right, one that mirrored the tension within the home. The city's narrow alleys and towering spires created natural corridors of shadow and sound, amplifying every creak and whisper. Its dense population of merchants, artisans, and servants ensured that no anomaly could go entirely unnoticed, yet the complexity of social hierarchies meant that observation was filtered through layers of interpretation, rumor, and superstition. In this way, the household of the whispering child became an intersection between the intimate and the public, the domestic and the urban, the real and the imagined. The city's presence lent credibility to the impossibility of the events unfolding inside, making the mystery both more tangible and more elusive, setting the stage for the psychological and supernatural tensions that would soon grip the family and the larger community alike. The morning after the nurse's departure, the household awoke to a silence that was at once ordinary and profoundly unsettling. The child's room, usually filled with the gentle hum of activity or the measured footsteps of a caretaker, seemed frozen in time. Toys were scattered across the floor, yet arranged in patterns that defied logic, as if the child had been attempting to communicate through objects rather than words. A small wooden horse stood on its side, facing the corner, while a set of blocks formed a line that led toward the window. On the surface, these arrangements appeared childish, but there was a deliberate quality to them, an intentionality that made the parents pause and exchange uneasy glances. The nurse had vanished without explanation, leaving behind not only her absence but a child who now seemed more perceptive, more inscrutable, than ever before. The child sat quietly by the window, eyes wide, following some invisible figure through the mist-laden streets of Prague. Whispered words fell softly from tiny lips, fragmented sentences that no adult could entirely comprehend. Sometimes the child seemed to speak to shadows in the corners of the room, other times to the empty spaces between the furniture, and occasionally, the words appeared aimed directly at the parents, yet in a language that was only partially intelligible. There was an uncanny rhythm to the whispers, a cadence that suggested thoughtfulness and purpose rather than random chatter. The parents attempted to intervene, asking questions and offering comfort, but each response from the child was cryptic, laced with an eerie certainty that unsettled even the most rational observers. Servants who had long grown accustomed to the child's quiet demeanor began to notice the subtle shift in atmosphere. The house itself seemed altered by the child's presence in ways that defied rational explanation. Doors that had been firmly closed would creak open, curtains would twitch as if brushed by unseen hands, and a chill often lingered near the child, even on the warmest of mornings. Some servants whispered amongst themselves, speculating that the nurse had taught the child some secret language or that the child had somehow inherited a sensitivity to things unseen. There was fear in these whispers, tempered by curiosity. No one could decide whether the child was simply gifted, profoundly imaginative, or something altogether more disturbing. The child's behavior was not confined to the room alone. During meals, the small figure would sit silently, sometimes murmuring to an empty chair across the table. Attempts to redirect attention with toys or reading exercises were met with resistance or subtle defiance, as though the child were aware of a presence beyond comprehension. It was during these moments that the parents began to feel the first true stirrings of fear. The child was not merely behaving unusually, but seemed to exist in a liminal space between the ordinary world and something beyond, a threshold that adults could sense but not cross. Each whispered phrase carried the weight of hidden knowledge, and the family found themselves questioning whether the child's innocence was genuine or a mask for something far more unsettling. Visitors to the house, often friends or distant relatives, could not escape the tension that clung to the rooms. A neighbor, upon entering the child's chamber, described a feeling of being watched, despite there being no apparent observer. The air felt thick, heavy with an indefinable energy that pressed against the chest. Chairs and furniture appeared subtly displaced from their usual positions, and the faint scent of lavender, once associated with the nurse, lingered in the corners. Adults left the house with a strange mixture of fascination and dread, exchanging whispered comments about the child's behavior and the inexplicable atmosphere that seemed to radiate from the room. Word of these incidents slowly spread through the immediate community, not as gossip, but as a quiet acknowledgement that something in the house was profoundly unusual. The child's whispers were not always audible to everyone. Some family members could hear them clearly, others only caught fragments, fleeting syllables carried on the wind. At times, the words seemed to prefigure events, small accidents, the misplacement of objects, the arrival of visitors. This predictive quality, whether coincidence or something more sinister, created a climate of unease. Parents and caretakers alike found themselves listening intently for the child's utterances, trying to decipher meaning, yet constantly frustrated by the incompleteness of the communication. It was as if the child existed partly within the visible world and partly within another plane of understanding, a dual existence that blurred the lines between innocence and foreboding. Sleep became a source of particular anxiety. At night, the child's murmuring intensified, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed almost ritualistic. The parents reported hearing phrases repeated in the darkness, words that seemed to echo in the hallways long after the child had gone to bed. Servants, too, noted unusual activity, shadows that shifted independently, the sound of soft footsteps pacing the corridor, the faint creak of furniture moving in otherwise empty rooms. Attempts to soothe the child with bedtime stories or prayers were met with partial compliance. The whispers never ceased, and often, the child would awaken in the early hours, eyes bright and alert, speaking in a voice that was not entirely their own. Despite the growing unease, the parents clung to reason. They sought to maintain routine and normalcy, emphasizing schoolwork, chores, and decorum. Yet the child's behavior resisted these measures, suggesting an intelligence and awareness that challenged conventional understanding. Psychologically, the child displayed a combination of dependence and independence, seeking attention at unexpected moments while simultaneously retreating into solitary murmurs. The duality created a tension within the household, as every attempt at guidance or correction seemed to be met with subtle defiance or enigmatic compliance. The ordinary structures of authority were undermined by a presence that appeared at once innocent and insurmountably mysterious. As weeks passed, the child's whispers became a fixture of daily life. They echoed through corridors, lingered near staircases, and occasionally spilled into the garden, where the child would speak to unseen listeners beneath the skeletal branches of winter trees. The household adapted in small ways. Servants tiptoed past rooms at certain hours, the parents avoided confronting the child directly about the whispers, and neighbors became cautious when visiting. The combination of fear, respect, and curiosity created a fragile equilibrium, one that held for a time but was destined to unravel as the city, the family, and the child themselves continued to intersect in ways that defied explanation. By the end of the first month, the household had transformed. The room that once held ordinary toys and books had become a chamber of whispers, a place where every shadow seemed significant and every sound laden with hidden meaning. The child's presence was no longer just that of an innocent dependent, it had become a locus of mystery, an axis around which fear, fascination, and speculation revolved. The nurse's absence, once a simple departure, had catalyzed a profound alteration in the atmosphere of the home, leaving behind a child whose voice carried both the weight of knowledge and the uncanny quality of a messenger from somewhere beyond comprehension. And as the family adjusted to this new reality, they could not yet perceive the deeper, darker forces that were quietly weaving themselves into the fabric of their lives. It was not long before the whispers ceased to be confined to the child's room. The household, once structured and orderly, began to feel invaded by sounds that had no apparent source, subtle yet persistent murmurs that drifted through hallways, stairwells, and empty parlors. Servants reported hearing faint voices when passing by closed doors, words that were indistinct but undeniably human. At first, these sounds were dismissed as the imagination, the creaking of old floorboards, or the drafts that seeped through centuries-old windows. But as the nights wore on, the murmurs became too precise, too intentional to be mere tricks of the mind. They seemed to respond to movement, intensify in the presence of those who listened, and fade when ignored, creating a dynamic that was both unsettling and inexplicably interactive. The family began to notice subtle changes in their perception of the house itself. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, lingering longer than a human figure should, while the corners of rooms seemed darker than was possible given the flickering light of candles or lamps. Doors that had been closed carefully would be found slightly ajar, drawers and cabinets shifted from their usual positions, though nothing appeared to be taken. The child's whispers were now joined by indistinct echoes, as if the house were imitating or amplifying the child's words. It became increasingly difficult to distinguish between what was real and what existed only in the mind, and the household started to fracture along these lines, each member interpreting the phenomena through their own fears and beliefs. Servants were the first to articulate the pattern. They spoke in hushed tones of hearing footsteps behind them in the corridors when they were alone, or catching fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when approached. One maid described opening a door to find a faintly glowing figure of the child standing motionless in the hallway, whispering in a tone that was both familiar and strange. The figure vanished when she blinked, leaving behind only the sense that she had glimpsed something extraordinary and terrifying. Others spoke of objects moving subtly, chairs sliding back from tables as if nudged by invisible hands, and the soft patter of tiny footsteps echoing in rooms long abandoned. Each account added weight to the idea that the household was no longer a safe or predictable space, but a labyrinth where ordinary reality had begun to fracture. The parents, initially skeptical, were forced to confront the undeniable strangeness of their environment. They would hear the child's whispered phrases carried faintly into adjacent rooms, repeated or twisted in ways that made comprehension difficult. At times, the whispers seemed to anticipate events. The father entering a room would hear the child's voice naming him before he arrived, or the mother would hear fragments of sentences describing objects that had not yet moved. This predictive quality, inexplicable and disturbing, lent an air of deliberate intent to the child's behavior, making the whispers feel almost sentient, as if the child and the house were working in tandem to communicate some hidden truth. The psychological tension escalated when the family's other children began to respond. The eldest sibling reported hearing voices calling their name from hallways where no one stood, and occasionally would find themselves drawn to rooms they had no reason to enter. Younger children displayed heightened anxiety, withdrawing into corners or clinging to objects for comfort. Dreams began to invade waking life, as family members described sleep interrupted by faint murmurs, feeling the touch of unseen hands, or glimpsing shadowy forms at the periphery of vision. Even during daylight hours, the house seemed alive, shadows moving against the natural course of light, whispering unintelligible words that the child's parents now recognized as fragments of the nightly disturbances. Attempts to document or rationalize the phenomena produced limited results. Parents would instruct servants to write down any strange occurrences, but the accounts were inconsistent, colored by fear and imagination. Physicians and visiting acquaintances, when invited to observe, dismissed the reports as hysteria or a manifestation of heightened attention in a child of sensitive temperament. Yet, when professionals remained in the house overnight, some reported fleeting impressions of whispers that mirrored the child's own, strange chills in rooms that were otherwise warm, and inexplicable noises that could not be attributed to drafts, plumbing, or the structure itself. Each failed attempt at explanation heightened the sense that the events were beyond ordinary understanding, that the household had crossed some threshold into a domain where reason alone could not prevail. Religious perspectives began to enter the discourse. A visiting priest, initially skeptical, noted the persistent whispers as a potential sign of spiritual disturbance. He suggested prayers, blessings, and even minor exorcisms to cleanse the home. These measures, however, produced no lasting effect, and sometimes seemed to coincide with an increase in the frequency and intensity of the murmurs. The child, previously quiet and compliant during these rituals, would sometimes whisper more urgently, appearing agitated or anxious when holy objects were present. This added another layer of complexity. The whispers were no longer passive but reactive, interacting with the intentions and beliefs of those around the child, as if some awareness existed outside human understanding. The neighborhood itself began to take notice, though subtly. Neighbors reported seeing faint light moving behind the tall, narrow windows late at night, hearing indistinct phrases carried faintly through the fog-laden streets, or glimpsing a small figure standing silently at a window. The stories circulated quietly, often dismissed as overactive imaginations or coincidences, yet the repetition of reports lent credibility to the notion that the household was experiencing phenomena not confined to imagination. By the time the community became fully aware, the whispers had become a defining feature of the house, a signal to outsiders that something extraordinary, troubling, and perhaps unexplainable was taking place within. The family attempted containment strategies. Doors were locked, windows shuttered, and servants instructed to remain vigilant. Yet no amount of physical control seemed to diminish the presence of the whispers. Sometimes they appeared to follow a specific pattern, emerging in rooms left unoccupied for hours, or responding directly to emotional states within the household. Fear, frustration, or anger seemed to provoke the whispers, while calm and distraction temporarily quieted them. In this way, the child's presence, combined with the ongoing phenomena in the house, created a feedback loop of tension. The more the family sought to assert control, the more the whispers seemed to assert themselves, bending perception and reality in ways that defied conventional understanding. The cumulative effect on the household was profound. Sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and growing suspicion among family members created a fragile psychological environment. Trust began to fracture, as parents and children alike questioned whether they could rely on their own senses or memories. Servants whispered in corners, debating whether to leave or remain in service. Each day the child's whispers persisted, acting as a constant reminder that the household had become a place where the ordinary rules no longer applied. By the time night fell on the fourth week after the nurse's disappearance, the house had been transformed. Once a haven of domestic routine, it had become a corridor of sound and shadow, a place where reality itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the unexplained. The household, now thoroughly unsettled by the persistent whispers, initially sought to suppress the growing panic through rational denial and strict enforcement of routine. The parents, proud of their social standing and determined to maintain appearances, instructed servants to ignore the sounds and treat the child's strange behaviors as inconsequential. Meals were served punctually, rooms were kept orderly, and the child was urged to behave properly, yet these attempts to impose normalcy only seemed to highlight the household's fragility. Each whispered word, each faint creak in the floorboards, became a challenge to the authority of reason and decorum. The more the family tried to assert control, the more apparent it became that the phenomena were resistant to discipline or instruction. Religious figures were brought in to address what some considered a spiritual disturbance. Priests and clerics visited the home, performing blessings and offering prayers meant to purify both the house and the child. Candles were lit in ceremonial arrangements, holy water was sprinkled across thresholds, and sacred texts were read aloud. While the adults hoped these interventions would restore order, they were met with ambiguous results. Sometimes the whispers seemed to pause or retreat, only to return with greater persistence. At other times, the child's murmurs would grow urgent or fretful in response to religious rites, suggesting an awareness of the rituals that went beyond simple understanding. The juxtaposition of faith and inexplicable phenomena created tension. Reason told them to trust in ritual, yet the outcomes consistently defied expectation, undermining confidence in both belief and authority. Meanwhile, the wider social context of Prague added additional pressure to suppress acknowledgement of the extraordinary. Families of their social standing were expected to maintain appearances, to present a facade of control, rationality, and propriety. Gossip could damage reputation, and word of unusual behavior in the household threatened to invite scrutiny or ridicule. For this reason, servants were instructed to remain silent about anything untoward, neighbors were politely avoided, and even within the family, discussion of the whispers was limited to hushed conversations behind closed doors. Denial became a coping mechanism as much as a social strategy, a means of shielding themselves from embarrassment while simultaneously attempting to manage a situation that had begun to feel unmanageable. The child, however, did not cooperate with these efforts at suppression. The whispers continued unabated, sometimes louder, sometimes more precise, and occasionally directing attention to matters that the adults would rather ignore. Objects would be displaced in subtle but significant ways, patterns in toys or books would suggest messages, and the child would speak in tones that implied both knowledge and judgment. The parents, caught between societal expectations, religious guidance, and the impossibility of controlling the phenomenon, experienced a growing sense of helplessness. Every effort to maintain normalcy seemed to underscore the household's descent into uncertainty, making the whispers not just audible but psychologically oppressive. Servants, too, struggled with their dual roles. They were tasked with upholding the household's order while also monitoring a child whose behavior defied explanation. Some quietly theorized that the nurse had taught the child occult knowledge, that the whispers were a learned behavior, or that the child was channeling some hidden faculty. Others feared a spiritual or supernatural presence, reluctant to voice such notions lest they invite censure or dismissal. Over time, a culture of subtle compliance emerged. Staff would acknowledge the whispers only in private, record observations discreetly, and avoid confrontation or direct questioning of the child. This tacit suppression allowed the phenomena to persist while minimizing outward disruption, but it also created a latent tension that seeped into every corner of the house. Attempts to explain the phenomena rationally often clashed with the persistent evidence of their presence. Psychologists or doctors who were consulted, though sparingly, offered explanations such as childhood trauma, heightened imagination, or hysteria, but these theories failed to account for the consistency, timing, and responsiveness of the whispers. In some cases, medical professionals noted the child's unusual attention to environmental detail and precognition of minor events, which made the rational explanations feel inadequate. Each dismissal by experts left the parents frustrated and anxious, caught between the desire to believe reasoned analysis and the undeniable persistence of the inexplicable. Neighbors, too, became part of the subtle framework of denial. While rumors inevitably circulated, polite interactions masked a collective effort to avoid overt acknowledgement. Families in the vicinity noticed strange activity, lights moving through windows late at night, indistinct murmurs carried by the fog, but social etiquette and fear of scandal ensured that these observations remained largely unspoken. The household's outward appearance of composure was maintained, yet beneath it, anxiety, speculation, and unease continued to grow. This combination of private observation and public suppression created an atmosphere in which the whispers were amplified in perception, their significance magnified by the very efforts to ignore them. Within the household itself, the interplay of denial and suppression began to shape behavior and relationships. Children were instructed to ignore the whispers, servants were discouraged from reporting them, and parents attempted to reassert authority through discipline and routine. Yet these strategies only highlighted the contrast between expectation and reality. The whispers, uncontained by social or domestic rules, acted as a persistent reminder of the limits of human control. Over time, the family began to recognize that the very act of denial was insufficient. The child's presence, the whispering, and the subtle disturbances within the house demanded acknowledgement, whether they wished to confront them or not. The dual forces of suppression, both internal, within the household, and external, within the social fabric of Prague, created a fragile equilibrium. The phenomena were contained in a practical sense but allowed to persist in a latent state, present and insistent, yet hidden from full view. This dynamic amplified the psychological tension. The more the family attempted to deny the whispers, the more they became aware of them, as if their suppression had only heightened their presence. By the end of the first months following the nurse's departure, the household existed in a suspended state, oscillating between denial and acknowledgement, caught in a delicate balance that could collapse under the weight of the child's persistence, the whispers, and the inexorable pressures of both society and the unknown. As the weeks passed, the tension within the household began to erode the fragile veneer of order that the parents had so carefully maintained. The whispers, once confined to the child's room, now seemed to seep into the minds of those who lived in the house, leaving traces of unease that would not dissipate with rational thought or physical barriers. Servants began reporting a growing sense of being observed even when alone, a persistent awareness that followed them through corridors and empty rooms. Some described hearing fragmented phrases of the child's whispers echoing after the child had gone to bed, words that carried an almost accusatory weight, as if the house itself were judging them for perceived negligence or disobedience. The boundaries between reality and imagination began to blur, and the household felt increasingly unstable, as though the structure of both mind and home were bending under the influence of forces they could not name. The parents themselves were not immune. Sleep deprivation, stress, and anxiety began to manifest in subtle but unmistakable ways. The father, once methodical and composed, found himself distracted during business dealings, his mind returning again and again to the child's murmurs and the disquieting sounds of the house at night. He began to double-check locks, examine windows, and inspect rooms for signs of intrusion, often finding nothing yet feeling certain that something had occurred. The mother, already emotionally attuned to the household's rhythms, experienced increasing paranoia, noticing subtle changes in shadows, fleeting movements in the corners of her vision, and strange patterns in the child's toys and drawings. Each day added layers of exhaustion and uncertainty, and the psychological strain began to manifest in both minor and significant lapses in judgment, heightening the sense that the household was unraveling from within. The child's whispers, far from remaining harmless or benign, began to exhibit a quality that some interpreted as intentional manipulation. Words were spoken in tones that shifted abruptly from tender to severe, from playful to commanding. Certain phrases seemed to hint at knowledge of private matters or secrets the child could not have otherwise known, while others conveyed warnings or instructions that the adults could neither comprehend nor safely ignore. The child's demeanor remained outwardly calm, almost serene, creating a chilling contrast with the mounting anxiety of those around them. It became increasingly difficult to distinguish between the child's innocence and the unsettling perception that they were. aware of, or perhaps controlling, the disturbances in the household. Servants, many of whom had served the family for years, began to express fear in subtle ways. Some would avoid entering certain rooms alone, whispering prayers under their breath or carrying small charms as protection. Others reported seeing fleeting shadows or feeling sudden chills in rooms previously considered safe. There were murmurs that the child's whispers had begun to influence behavior, leading to accidental falls, misplacements of household items, or sudden moments of irrational anger or fear. These events were often dismissed as coincidence, yet the cumulative effect on the household psyche was profound, contributing to a sense of encroaching madness, as if the very walls of the house were infused with the child's presence and the mysterious energy of the whispers. Even the family's other children were affected. The eldest sibling, once confident and curious, began exhibiting anxiety, waking at odd hours to listen to the whispers, and reporting visions of shadowed figures that no one else could see. Younger siblings became withdrawn, reluctant to leave rooms where the whispers were most audible, and in some cases, they began to mimic the child's murmurs, repeating fragmented words and phrases that they could not fully understand. The household's emotional climate shifted, fear and suspicion replaced trust, and the parents' attempts to maintain discipline were undermined by the pervasive sense of uncertainty. The ordinary rhythms of daily life were disrupted, replaced by an obsessive vigilance that only intensified the atmosphere of dread. Attempts to seek external intervention provided little relief. Visiting physicians and clergy offered advice and ritual, but their influence was limited, and the child's behavior continued to resist explanation. When priests performed blessings, the child sometimes appeared agitated, murmuring more urgently or retreating to corners of the room, eyes wide with awareness. Doctors attributed the events to nervous tension or heightened perception, yet the accuracy and consistency of the child's whispers could not be fully explained by these rational theories. Each failed intervention deepened the family's sense of helplessness, creating a psychological environment in which fear, uncertainty, and the sense of encroaching madness fed upon one another. Even the physical environment seemed complicit in the household's descent. Shadows lengthened and deepened in unnatural ways, floorboards creaked with no discernible cause, and the air carried a chill that could not be attributed to weather or draft. The child's room became the epicenter, yet the disturbances radiated outward, infiltrating dining areas, hallways, and common rooms. The house seemed alive with subtle movements and sounds, each reinforcing the perception that reality itself had become unstable. The combination of audible whispers, environmental anomalies, and psychological strain created a feedback loop in which each member of the household became increasingly sensitive to the next, amplifying fear, tension, and the sensation of being drawn into an incomprehensible and malevolent web. By the third month following the nurse's disappearance, the family's social interactions had begun to erode. Friends and neighbors, once welcome, were now discouraged from visiting, as the family feared judgment or disbelief. The household's reputation, carefully maintained before, became secondary to the overwhelming task of simply managing the environment inside the house. Anxiety, suspicion, and emotional exhaustion dominated daily life, leaving the parents and servants alike in a constant state of heightened alert. The house, once a place of domestic order, had become a crucible in which fear, whispers, and perceived supernatural presence were slowly corroding the boundaries of rationality and sanity. The encroachment of madness was subtle, cumulative, and relentless. It did not manifest in dramatic outbursts, but in quiet disorientation, obsessive attentiveness, and emotional fragility. Each whispered phrase from the child, each unexplained noise or shadow, served as a reminder that the household's control was fragile, temporary, and increasingly illusory. The family lived in an atmosphere of perpetual anticipation, waiting for the next whisper, the next movement, or the next unexplained event. By this point it was no longer just the child who seemed otherworldly, the house itself, the family, and the servants had all been drawn into the orbit of something ineffable, leaving them teetering on the edge of psychological collapse, their minds and lives infiltrated by the relentless, insidious presence of the whispering child. As the phenomenon within the household persisted, the parents felt compelled to seek explanations beyond superstition or fear. They reached out to physicians, scholars, and individuals versed in the emerging fields of psychology and medicine, hoping that rational inquiry could illuminate the cause of the child's unsettling whispers. Initially, the visitors approached with professional detachment, their assumptions grounded in logic and empirical observation. They examined the child's behavior, observed the household, and attempted to document occurrences in systematic ways. Yet, even as they applied scientific methods, they encountered difficulties that challenged conventional reasoning. The child's whispers, far from being random or meaningless, displayed patterns, timing, and awareness that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The physicians first considered neurological and developmental factors. They assessed the child for hearing abnormalities, speech impediments, or other conditions that could produce unusual vocalizations. Standard tests revealed nothing remarkable, the child's physical health appeared robust, and cognitive development was consistent with their age. Attention then turned to psychological explanations, heightened imagination, trauma, or stress-induced behavior. While these theories offered partial insight, they failed to account for the specificity of the whispers, particularly instances in which the child seemed to reference events outside the household or anticipate occurrences before they happened. Each unexplained event pushed the boundaries of conventional science, leaving the household and the professionals alike to grapple with the uncomfortable notion that their understanding of reality might be insufficient. Observations were extended to the household environment. Researchers meticulously noted the positions of objects, the timing of the whispers, and the child's movements, attempting to identify triggers or environmental cues. Certain patterns emerged. The whispers often coincided with moments of emotional intensity, either in the child or among the adults, and sometimes appeared in response to external stimuli, footsteps in the street, distant sounds, or changes in the weather. Even with these patterns, however, the explanations remained speculative. The phenomena resisted containment, and each hypothesis seemed to create more questions than answers. The house, once a familiar and stable setting, became a laboratory for the inexplicable, its walls echoing with a mystery that defied rational categorization. Some investigators proposed that the child had learned subtle manipulations from the missing nurse. They theorized that she might have employed psychological techniques, intentionally or otherwise, that trained the child to respond in ways that seemed preternatural. While this explanation accounted for some behavioral nuances, it did not fully explain moments of predictive or seemingly clairvoyant behavior. Certain events occurred independently of any known training, and in ways that aligned with precise circumstances unknown to the household. The gap between learned behavior and apparent supernatural insight deepened the sense of uncertainty, and the household increasingly oscillated between hope for rational explanation and the terror of inexplicable knowledge. Religious and cultural beliefs were intertwined with scientific inquiry, creating an unusual hybrid of perspectives. Some scholars and clerics participated in discussions, suggesting that the child might possess latent sensitivity to spiritual or energetic currents, while others attempted to reconcile these ideas with physiological or psychological mechanisms. The dialogue between rationality and mysticism intensified the intellectual tension in the household. The more the phenomena were scrutinized, the more resistant they appeared to interpretation, highlighting the limitations of human understanding and the complex interplay between observation, expectation, and belief. Documentation became a priority. Visitors kept detailed notes, recording times, conditions, and the content of the whispers whenever possible. These records revealed recurring phrases, sequences, and themes, suggesting a level of intentionality and communication that surpassed simple childhood play. Some phrases referred to events outside the immediate awareness of the adults, lending a predictive or telepathic quality to the behavior. The systematic recording of these occurrences only heightened the fascination and dread. The child's voice had become a data point, yet it remained inexplicably alive, resisting reduction to simple cause and effect. Even the household's layout and design were analyzed in attempts to rationalize the sounds. Architects and engineers examined the building, testing acoustics, airflow, and structural peculiarities that could amplify or distort ordinary noises. While minor anomalies were noted, floorboards that echoed more in certain areas, gaps that could carry sound, these could not account for the specificity, timing, or apparent intelligence of the whispers. Every physical explanation fell short, leaving the investigators with the persistent sense that the child's voice interacted with something beyond the tangible, something that defied scientific containment. Despite these frustrations, the inquiries had an effect. Rational observation and careful documentation created a framework for understanding the phenomenon, even if complete comprehension remained elusive. The family felt a cautious sense of agency. By observing, recording, and testing, they were engaging with the unknown in a systematic way, rather than succumbing entirely to fear. Yet, paradoxically, the more they measured and analyzed, the more the child's behavior seemed to respond, as if the very act of scientific scrutiny was acknowledged by the whispers themselves. The dynamic between observation and response introduced a new dimension to the mystery, blurring the lines between experimenter and subject, between observer and participant. By the end of this period of rational inquiry, it was clear that neither superstition nor science could fully contain or explain the phenomenon. The child's whispers existed at the intersection of psychology, environment, and something else, something ineffable, beyond categorization. The household, once confident in the supremacy of reason, had come to recognize the limits of human understanding. The child's presence, and the persistent whispers, remained a force that could be studied but not entirely controlled, documented but not fully comprehended, rationalized but never reduced to simple terms. In this way, the rational inquiry, though invaluable, only intensified the household's awareness of the uncanny, leaving them both fascinated and unsettled, aware that the mystery had no immediate resolution and that their attempts at explanation were themselves part of a larger, enigmatic pattern. As months passed, the household became increasingly isolated, both physically and socially, a direct consequence of the persistent whispers and the growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate every room. Friends and extended family were subtly discouraged from visiting. Neighbors, once casual companions, avoided the house altogether, murmuring rumors that mingled fear with fascination. The child's whispers had begun to shape the perception of everyone who approached the home, creating a barrier between the household and the outside world. The family, initially intent on preserving appearances, found themselves forced into seclusion. Each day, the house grew quieter in some ways but more charged in others, as if the absence of visitors allowed the whispers and shadowed movements to intensify, filling spaces once occupied by ordinary life. The physical structure of the house seemed to echo this withdrawal. Corridors grew darker, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and rooms that were once cheerful or neutral took on a haunted quality. The parents began to restrict access to certain areas, locking doors or sealing off passages where the whispers were most active. Yet these measures were largely symbolic. The disturbances moved, adapting to the limitations imposed, following the family and the servants from room to room. Even open windows failed to dissipate the strange energy, as if the house itself, or some unseen presence within it, refused to be contained. Each attempt at control underscored the futility of resistance and deepened the household's sense of isolation. The psychological strain was severe. The father, once practical and composed, found himself preoccupied, pacing hallways at odd hours, listening for the faintest murmurs, and interpreting minor sounds as evidence of some deliberate presence. He grew irritable, impatient with both servants and children, yet unable to articulate the root of his fear. The mother, emotionally sensitive and attentive, experienced a combination of dread and helplessness, feeling the weight of responsibility for both the child and the household while simultaneously being unable to alter the escalating phenomenon. The servants, now aware that suppression was insufficient, moved cautiously, often whispering prayers or carrying small charms for protection. Every creak, every sigh of the building, every fragment of whispered syllable compounded the emotional pressure, gradually wearing down the mental resilience of all within. The child's behavior, now central to the household's dynamic, continued to challenge perception and authority. Whispers increased in frequency and precision, sometimes occurring in rooms no one occupied, at times addressing individuals who were alone and yet directly implicated in the phrases. The child remained outwardly calm, almost indifferent to the anxiety their presence induced, creating a dissonance between innocence and enigma. Furniture continued to shift subtly, toys and objects were arranged in new patterns overnight, and the child's gaze often lingered on corners or spaces that no adult could identify as significant. The result was a household in which attention and vigilance became constant, an environment where every movement and sound was suspect, and where the ordinary rhythms of daily life had been supplanted by a relentless, unexplainable tension. Attempts to reintroduce social normalcy were met with resistance, both from within and without. Visitors, brief and cautious, often returned accounts of faint voices, shadows, and an oppressive atmosphere, reinforcing the family's self-imposed isolation. Even when medical or clerical professionals attempted observation, the household found the dynamics difficult to manage. The child's whispers often appeared to respond directly to the presence of outsiders, creating a sense of surveillance that intensified paranoia. Ordinary conversation became strained, laughter rare, and daily routines heavily regimented to minimize exposure to the unexplained phenomena. In effect, the household existed as a microcosm of suspended reality, removed from the rhythms of the outside world, enmeshed in a cycle of observation, anxiety, and whispered communication. Isolation had tangible effects on the family's relationships. Trust, previously strong, began to fracture under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Parents questioned each other's interpretations, servants whispered privately about events that seemed inconsistent, and even the children's interactions were shaped by caution, suspicion, and an acute awareness of the whisper's implications. The household became a space in which reality was continuously negotiated, interpreted, and misinterpreted, a place where the boundaries between perception and imagination were in constant flux. Arguments, previously rare, grew more frequent. Misunderstandings, once minor, escalated under the stress of an environment in which every sound or movement could be charged with hidden meaning. The family's reliance on routine, once a stabilizing force, began to falter. Meals were eaten in silence or near silence, the presence of visitors minimized, and daily chores became exercises in vigilance rather than efficiency. The servants, who had once operated with confidence and purpose, now approached tasks cautiously, often hesitating in hallways where whispers lingered or avoiding rooms where shadows seemed to move independently. The home itself, an entity that had previously offered security and familiarity, now reinforced the psychological strain, amplifying fear, heightening awareness, and making isolation not merely a social condition but a lived experience embedded in the very structure of daily life. Attempts at rationalization, documentation, or religious intervention offered only intermittent relief. Clerics could perform blessings, doctors could record patterns, and family members could note observations, but these measures were insufficient to restore the ordinary flow of domestic life. The whispers continued, adapting to scrutiny, and the child remained a focal point of both anxiety and mystery. Over time, it became clear that the household's collapse was not dramatic but incremental, a steady erosion of normalcy, punctuated by moments of acute fear, disorientation, and helplessness. Each day, the isolation deepened, creating a feedback loop in which the lack of external engagement allowed the whispers and subtle disturbances to dominate the household's consciousness entirely. By the end of this period, the house existed in a liminal state, partially inhabited by ordinary life, partially controlled by whispers and shadows. The family's external connections had frayed, their internal cohesion strained, and the boundaries of perception were increasingly unstable. Daily existence became an exercise in endurance, each individual navigating the house with a heightened awareness of sound, movement, and the ever-present possibility of the inexplicable. The household's collapse was not marked by destruction but by the gradual, almost imperceptible encroachment of a new reality, a reality in which the child's whispers dictated the rhythm of life, and in which isolation and fear had become inseparable from daily existence. When the whispers finally subsided, or at least became less perceptible to the family, a profound stillness settled over the household. The child, once a source of constant murmuring and cryptic insight, seemed to withdraw into themselves, speaking only in ordinary tones and observing the world with a quiet, unreadable patience. The absence of constant whispers was not entirely comforting, it left a vacuum filled with memory, anxiety, and lingering suspicion. The household's members, having endured months of psychological strain, found themselves haunted not by sound but by silence, a silence that carried the weight of what had transpired and the unspoken acknowledgement that the boundaries of their understanding had been tested and broken. The physical environment of the house retained subtle traces of the months-long phenomena. Objects remained slightly displaced, corners bore faint, inexplicable marks on walls and furniture, and certain rooms held an unshakable chill that resisted explanation. Servants noted that the child's former routines, the carefully arranged toys, the patterns in books and objects, and the areas where whispers had been most persistent, were untouched yet evocative, a lingering testament to the intensity of previous disturbances. Even the air seemed different, heavier in ways difficult to articulate, as though the house itself remembered the tension, observation, and psychic strain that had defined its recent history. Community awareness evolved into cautious silence. Neighbors who had once whispered about shadows, lights, and sounds now observed a polite distance, as though the household's troubles had entered an unspoken agreement of discretion. Word of the strange events circulated selectively, often framed as tales of child imagination or overactive nerves, leaving most of Prague unaware of the full intensity of what had occurred. Those who had observed the house from the outside, merchants, acquaintances, and casual visitors, remarked only on a lingering aura, a subtle apprehension that seemed to cling to the windows and gates, a signal that something extraordinary and perhaps unsettling had passed through the home. In effect, the household's silence became contagious, its presence felt indirectly yet powerfully by the surrounding community. The family's internal dynamics, forever altered by months of whispered phenomena, required careful management. Trust, eroded by fatigue and fear, had to be cautiously rebuilt. Parents were attentive in ways that were both protective and restrained, conscious of the fragility of the household's equilibrium. The child, while outwardly calm, remained enigmatic, and the family learned to navigate the space between normalcy and the memory of months in which ordinary life had been suspended. The adults were keenly aware that any sudden intrusion, whether social, emotional, or environmental, might reactivate old fears. In this way, silence was not simply the absence of whispering but a delicate balance, a tenuous coexistence with the memory of disturbance that could be destabilized at any moment. Attempts to rationalize the past continued, though always with the recognition that total understanding was impossible. Physicians, scholars, and even clergy who had visited over the months were consulted again, their reports carefully reviewed. Various explanations were proposed: heightened sensitivity in the child, learned behavior, psychological contagion, or a combination of environmental and emotional factors. Some theories acknowledged the possibility of the inexplicable, emphasizing the limits of contemporary understanding rather than offering definitive resolution. The family engaged with these interpretations selectively, accepting some points and dismissing others, always aware that the full truth remained obscured behind layers of perception, memory, and the mysterious intelligence that had guided the child's whispers. The child's perspective during this period is largely unknown, leaving historians and chroniclers to speculate. Some suggest that the child may have perceived or interpreted events in ways inaccessible to adult comprehension, that the whispers were an expression of thought, fear, or insight beyond ordinary speech. Others theorize that the child's retreat into silence represented an internalization of months of observation, perhaps a coping mechanism that allowed for survival within a household that had become both protective and oppressive. Whatever the explanation, it is clear that the child's role in the household's psychological landscape remained central, shaping interactions, memory, and perception even after the audible whispers had ceased. Psychologically, the family experienced residual effects for years. Sleep patterns, emotional resilience, and interpersonal trust were subtly altered. Even the return to external social life required careful negotiation, as neighbors, relatives, and visitors remained attuned to the possibility of recurrence. Children who had witnessed or interacted with the whispering environment often carried memories that influenced their behavior into adolescence and adulthood. The parents, burdened by both responsibility and uncertainty, maintained a cautious demeanor, aware that the memory of the whispers could be invoked at any time by an unexpected sound, a shadow, or a sudden movement in the periphery of vision. The broader cultural implications of the household's experience are notable. While local records mention the child and the mysterious whispers, the events were largely obscured by polite discretion, selective memory, and social pressure. Only fragments of diaries, letters, and occasional third-party accounts survive, each colored by subjective perception, anxiety, and the inherent difficulty of describing phenomena that resist conventional explanation. These fragments offer tantalizing glimpses, references to shadowed corridors, the intensity of observation, and the lingering chill of the house. Yet they stop short of providing complete clarity, leaving the story suspended between recorded fact, personal recollection, and the interpretive lens of later historians and storytellers. Over time, the household settled into a cautious routine, carefully calibrated to avoid reminders of past disturbances. Rooms were rearranged, windows opened to sunlight, and new furniture replaced older objects associated with the whispered months. Yet even as physical changes were made, the psychological and emotional residue remained. Family members spoke of the past in careful, measured tones, aware that discussing the phenomena too directly could revive dormant anxieties. The silence of the household was both a relief and a reminder, a tangible acknowledgement that some mysteries endure beyond explanation, that some experiences imprint themselves indelibly upon memory, and that certain voices, whether literal or symbolic, cannot be entirely forgotten. Ultimately, the aftermath of the whispers left the household in a state of uneasy equilibrium. Normalcy was partially restored, yet the memory of months filled with cryptic speech, subtle manipulation, and pervasive anxiety persisted. The child had survived, the family remained intact, and the house continued to function as a home. Yet the experience had fundamentally altered the perception of reality within the household, leaving an enduring awareness that the ordinary world contains spaces beyond comprehension, where silence can be as potent and as unsettling as the most persistent of whispers. Even decades after the whispers had faded, scholars, historians, and paranormal enthusiasts remained captivated by the enigma of the child and the Prague household. The events were examined through multiple lenses, psychological, historical, spiritual, and socio-cultural, yet no single explanation fully accounted for the persistence, precision, or apparent intelligence of the whispers. Researchers debated endlessly, analyzing fragmentary records, diaries, and anecdotal accounts, all while acknowledging that the phenomenon had occurred within a subjective, emotionally charged environment. Each theory offered insight but also introduced new ambiguities, reinforcing the sense that the true nature of the child's whispers remained beyond the reach of reason. One prominent theory focused on the child's psychological and developmental attributes. Experts speculated that the child may have possessed an extraordinary sensitivity to environmental stimuli, a heightened cognitive awareness that enabled the perception of subtle cues unnoticed by adults. This could include minor auditory signals, changes in airflow, or subtle movements within the house, which the child interpreted and then echoed through whispers that appeared predictive or intelligent. While plausible to an extent, this explanation could not account for reports of the child referencing events outside immediate perception, nor could it clarify instances where the whispers appeared to react deliberately to interventions by clergy, physicians, or visitors. Nevertheless, the theory of heightened perceptual acuity remains a foundational point in understanding the household's psychological dynamics. A second theory considered the influence of social and environmental conditioning. Some historians argued that the child may have unconsciously absorbed patterns from the missing nurse, whose behavior was never fully documented. According to this hypothesis, months of close attention and subtle instruction could have trained the child to mimic speech patterns, anticipate responses, and orchestrate actions in ways that seemed supernatural. Yet even this theory struggles to reconcile the child's apparent foresight and the precision with which the whispers addressed individuals' private concerns. While learned behavior offers part of the puzzle, it cannot fully explain the extraordinary circumstances reported by multiple witnesses, both within and outside the household. Religious and spiritual interpretations have also persisted. Clerics and folklorists suggested that the child may have been attuned to spiritual currents or residual energy within the house, acting as a conduit between ordinary reality and unseen dimensions. The persistence of whispers, their responsiveness to rituals, and the eerie consistency across months seem to support the notion of spiritual influence. Such perspectives, however, clash with empirical analysis and remain largely speculative, dependent on belief systems that are themselves variable and culturally informed. They do, nonetheless, highlight the human need to find meaning in phenomena that challenge comprehension, revealing as much about observers as about the observed. Some modern researchers propose that the phenomenon represents an intersection of psychological contagion and environmental suggestion. In this view, the adult's heightened fear and attention amplified minor stimuli into perceivable patterns. Shadows became ominous, sounds became whispers, and the child's natural behaviors were interpreted through a lens of expectation and anxiety. The feedback loop between the family's attention and the child's behavior may have created a self-reinforcing system in which both perception and reality were subtly shaped by collective focus. This theory aligns with aspects of the historical record, particularly the household's isolation, the emotional tension of parents and servants, and the gradual escalation of suspicion and fear. Yet it leaves open the question of why the whispers exhibited apparent foreknowledge and the uncanny specificity that was reported consistently by multiple witnesses. Folkloric accounts and anecdotal reports complicate the picture further. Neighboring families recalled moments when the child's whispers seemed to extend beyond the walls of the house, drifting faintly into streets and adjacent buildings. Others described the house itself as appearing different at night, shadowed, almost sentient, with lights flickering in response to events inside. Such reports suggest that the household's experience was not entirely private, and that the whisper's influence, whether real or perceived, had a broader spatial and social dimension. While difficult to verify, these accounts contribute to the lingering sense that the phenomenon cannot be fully reduced to individual psychology or learned behavior alone. Historians have also examined the social and cultural context of 1892 Prague to better understand the family's response. The weight of social expectation, the importance of maintaining appearances, and the fear of scandal likely shaped the household strategies of denial, suppression, and selective documentation. This cultural lens provides a plausible framework for why the events were recorded in fragmentary and often ambiguous ways, why interventions were both cautious and contradictory, and why the phenomenon persisted without broad acknowledgement. Yet social context, while illuminating human behavior, cannot fully account for the mysterious qualities of the whispers themselves. Even contemporary parapsychologists have entered the discussion, suggesting that the child may have been sensitive to subtle, undetected forms of energy or consciousness. They point to recurring phrases, predictive content, and reactive qualities of the whispers as evidence of interaction with a reality not fully accessible to conventional perception. While mainstream science remains skeptical, these interpretations underscore the difficulty of categorically dismissing reports, particularly when multiple independent witnesses observed consistent phenomena. The dialogue between rationality, anecdote, and speculation continues, with each perspective illuminating different facets of the mystery while leaving the core unresolved. Ultimately, the child's whispers remain emblematic of an enduring tension between the explainable and the inexplicable. They demonstrate how extraordinary events, especially those experienced within intimate domestic spaces, challenge human understanding, evoke fear and fascination, and inspire attempts at classification across multiple disciplines. The final theories, psychological sensitivity, learned behavior, spiritual attunement, environmental feedback, and social influence, offer plausible explanations but fall short of definitively resolving the mystery. Each leaves gaps that invite further inquiry, reflection, and speculation, reinforcing the notion that some phenomena resist finality. The unresolved nature of the case has ensured its persistence in both historical and cultural memory. Scholars, storytellers, and enthusiasts continue to explore archives, letters, and anecdotal reports, seeking patterns, explanations, or insight into the child's remarkable and enigmatic behavior. The whispers, once a constant presence, have become a symbol, a reminder that the boundaries of perception, understanding, and reality are sometimes porous, that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, and that even in the apparent silence of the past, questions endure. The household, the child, and the months of whispered mystery remain a cautionary testament to the limits of knowledge, the power of observation, and the enduring allure of the unexplained. The house in Prague, long after the whispers had ceased, retained an almost legendary aura within local memory. Stories of the child and the household's months of quiet terror were passed down cautiously, often softened or reframed in ways that made them more palatable, yet the core enigma persisted. Families in the neighborhood recalled fleeting moments of unease when passing by the old residence, an inexplicable sensation of being observed, or a faint echo of the murmured phrases long attributed to the child. The phenomenon had transcended its temporal bounds, embedding itself in collective memory as both cautionary tale and unsolved mystery, a reminder that some events leave traces far beyond their immediate occurrence. The child, now grown, remained largely obscure in historical records. Adults who had witnessed the months of whispered phenomena offered sparse accounts, often contradictory, shaped by years of reflection, selective memory, and the natural human desire to reconcile fear with reason. The child's later life was marked by ambiguity. Some suggest continued social withdrawal, others claim that they led a seemingly ordinary existence. Yet even ordinary lives could not erase extraordinary memory. Letters, diaries, and occasional third-party accounts hint at a continued sensitivity, subtle behaviors, and peculiar insight into social and emotional dynamics, as though the child's early experiences had forged an enduring lens through which the world was perceived. This ambiguity fuels ongoing fascination and speculation, sustaining the child's story within both academic and popular discourse. The house itself became an object of curiosity and wariness. Architectural historians and local chroniclers documented its unusual features, including rooms where shadows seemed more persistent, floorboards that creaked in irregular patterns, and spaces where a chill lingered inexplicably. Visitors occasionally reported minor disturbances, subtle anomalies, or the uncanny sensation of being watched, though these accounts were often dismissed as anecdotal or the product of expectation. Nevertheless, the building's reputation solidified a kind of haunted legacy. Even after the child had grown, the environment where the whispers had occurred remained suffused with narrative tension, a physical embodiment of the events that had once unfolded within its walls. The legacy of the whispers extended into cultural memory, influencing folklore, literature, and local storytelling. Tales of the child were woven into narratives that emphasized caution, respect for the unseen, and the persistence of mystery. Writers and chroniclers drew on the household's history as a source of inspiration, often focusing on the tension between innocence and intelligence, normalcy and the uncanny, the mundane and the inexplicable. This process of cultural codification transformed personal trauma into collective legend, ensuring that the story of the whispers would endure far beyond the individuals directly involved. In essence, the child's presence, once confined to the household, became a symbol of the fragile boundary between perception and reality, a cautionary emblem of the limits of understanding. The phenomenon also provoked scholarly reflection on the nature of memory, perception, and interpretation. Psychologists and historians debated the extent to which fear, attention, and expectation could have amplified ordinary events into what was remembered as the extraordinary. Some argued that the whispers were amplified by social and emotional contagion, reinforced by the household's isolation and heightened vigilance. Others maintained that the child's behavior demonstrated an unusual cognitive or sensory acuity, capable of perceiving details that eluded others. In both cases, the phenomenon illustrated how human cognition can be simultaneously reliable and fallible, capable of perceiving and interpreting reality while remaining vulnerable to distortion, suggestion, and anxiety. Religious and philosophical commentators also contributed to the ongoing dialogue surrounding the whispers. The case was used to explore the nature of consciousness, the limits of human understanding, and the possible existence of dimensions beyond ordinary perception. The child became an exemplar in debates about spiritual sensitivity, precognition, and the intersection of innocence with phenomena that defy rational explanation. These discussions, while speculative, underscore the enduring power of the event to challenge assumptions, provoke thought, and inspire inquiry into realms where the known and the unknown converge. The whispers, though long gone, continued to resonate as a point of intellectual and emotional exploration. Local communities, too, maintained a cautious reverence for the house and its history. Children were warned to respect the space, neighbors spoke of the former household in hushed tones, and the events were recounted as both a lesson in prudence and a reminder that not all phenomena can be categorized or understood. This collective caution transformed the house into a subtle monument to mystery, an anchor for memory, and a touchstone for cultural continuity. The child's whispers, ephemeral yet persistent, became entwined with the social consciousness, influencing behavior and narrative long after direct experience had ended. The passage of time did not diminish the story's allure. Generations later, researchers and storytellers revisited records, letters, and oral histories, drawn to the unresolved tension between explanation and enigma. Each new analysis or retelling raised fresh questions. Did the child truly perceive events beyond ordinary awareness? Were the whispers a product of learned behavior, heightened perception, or spiritual attunement? Could the household's isolation and anxiety have amplified phenomena that were otherwise ordinary? The multiplicity of interpretations ensured that the mystery remained vibrant, challenging scholars, enthusiasts, and casual readers alike to confront the limits of certainty. In the end, the legacy of the whispering child is defined as much by its absence as by its presence. The quiet that followed months of disturbance was not a closure but a space for reflection, speculation, and unease. It allowed memory, narrative, and cultural imagination to flourish, transforming an intensely private and traumatic experience into a story of enduring fascination. The household, the child, and the events surrounding the whispers collectively represent a nexus of fear, curiosity, and mystery, a case study in how the extraordinary can infiltrate ordinary life and how perception, memory, and culture can preserve that intrusion for generations. Ultimately, the whispering child of Prague remains an emblem of unresolved enigma. Their story reminds us that some events resist simplification, that innocence can coexist with uncanny awareness, and that the world contains phenomena that challenge the boundaries of comprehension. The legacy is both haunting and instructive, a testament to the power of mystery, the persistence of memory, and the human desire to seek meaning where understanding may remain forever elusive. The whispers may have ended, but their echo endures in houses, minds, and the cultural imagination, a quiet, persistent reminder that some questions have no final answers.